Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. As the war, as the war in Ukraine intensifies, we are experiencing a sense of loss. The sense of loss when we see thousands of people dying and escaping violence, the loss of peace among nations, the loss of security, and the loss of democracy. Today, we have with us Dr. Pauline Boss. Dr. Boss is emeritus professor at the University of Minnesota. She is known worldwide for developing the theory of ambiguous loss and as a pioneer in the interdisciplinary study of family stress management. Today, we will speak about her latest book, The Myth of Closure, Ambiguous Loss in a Time of Pandemic and Change. Dr. Boss, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
I feel like we need someone to hold us by the hand and tell us that eventually everything will be okay. I feel like we are suffering a loss in our society, and we need a grown-up to tell us that we are going to survive. So I wonder if we could start by telling us a little bit about your background and yes, how is it that you became a writer and an expert on ambiguous loss?
Oh my. Well, I'm more than a grown up. I'm more like your grandparent because I'm in my late 80s. And I must say that it is true. I was a young girl when World War II was starting to break out. And I saw the fear in my parents' faces. My father was an immigrant, and he was from Switzerland. And so the war was right next door to his family back in the old country. So what I've learned from childhood on up is that there are times of fear, there are times of terrible troubles. We've just gone through the pandemic, which in and of itself was horrible. Many, many people died. And now we have a threat of war and an actual war in Ukraine, and the suffering of people, both from death and from ambiguous losses, where you see them on television, where a father and mother are saying goodbye, and the mother and children are going on a train, and the father is going back to fight. They don't know where each other are now, and that is a classic ambiguous loss, when loved ones who are attached are separated, but you don't know if they're alive or dead, or if they will ever see them again. That's the horror of this time. Yes.
You know, I have such a big feeling of helplessness. In World War II, there was this man called Hitler, and he was deciding whether people would live or die. And now today we have this person by the name of Putin deciding who will live and who will die and under which conditions. And we are watching from afar, and we want to help in any way possible. And we are in despair because we don't know how.
That's right. That was true with the pandemic, but then the scientists gave us a way out to fight the virus. And most people took it, some people did not. So it became an epidemic of the non-vaccinated. Now, with what's happening today, there is not a scientific solution, vaccine for what is happening in Eastern Europe today. But I think what I've written about in the book is about what we in America do when we can control the situation. We are pretty well off. We have been, until the pandemic, pretty much had it our way for a long time. At least most people did. I understand some people did not. People in poverty did not. People of color did not. But right now, we are overwhelmed with not having things go our way. And in a country that's very mastery oriented, like we are, we solve problems. That's what we like to do. We like winning. We do not like loss. We do not like losing. Well, we have lost a lot in the pandemic, and the world is losing a lot right now with what is going on in Eastern Europe. And we will have effects like higher prices at the gas station and so on. I think we shouldn't be complaining about it. We still have it better than most. And what we need to do, because we are so used to having our own way and having a solution, we need to increase our tolerance for ambiguity, for not having a solution, for not knowing what's going to happen next. We're not very good at that. Eastern cultures are better at that than we are. And we have to borrow from them a little bit about how to live calmly in a situation where you have no control. One of the things we learned during the pandemic is people found control to balance the inability to control the virus. They were baking bread. They were cleaning out closets. They were doing exercises. They were learning a new language. They were doing new things. Wonderful. That was wonderful. Pat yourself on the back, because that is increasing your tolerance for ambiguity.
Can you talk about the myth of closure? That the idea that we can just close a parenthesis and move on. That, you know, if my aunt died during the pandemic, that I could just mourn for about 5 days and then move on with life and let that go. I mean, but it doesn't happen like that. I still think about my aunt and the misery and sorrow that everybody else in their family went to down there in Colombia, my native land.
Well, that's another Euro-American idea, is the myth of closure. If you don't like something that's happening, if it involves suffering or sadness or mourning, you have about 3 days and then get over it. We are very intolerant of suffering because it reminds us of something we can't control. So it's related to what I just said. But in fact, closure is a very good word to use in business deals, when you close a contract or when you close a road after a snowstorm here in Minnesota. But it's a terrible word to use in human relationships. There is no closure even after a clear-cut death. You still remember the person, but it's a both and situation. You both know that they are transformed, that they are no longer breathing, that they have died. And you also remember them and keep them close to your heart and in your mind. And so that's the way most of the world does it. And we need to also learn to do it that way. People who search for closure after a death really delay their because they're searching for something that won't happen. And what we know now is that you find meaning in your loss, and you can live with that loss forever. You might even be sad 20 years from now when you are reminded of something. My husband died too during the 2 years of COVID of a stroke, though he was very elderly and sick. And I still think of him, of course, and especially when I go to the theater now, when I return to the concert hall, where we had always done that for decades together. So this is a clear-cut loss. Death is a clear-cut loss. And you asked me before about ambiguous loss, which we see now when people couldn't visit their loved ones and you couldn't hug somebody. There's a physical ambiguous loss where somebody you love is missing physically, like you see on the TV now in Ukraine when families are split. But there's also a psychological ambiguous loss where the person is there, perhaps even in front of you, but they no longer know who you are.
Wow.
So they are missing psychologically, as the example would be with Alzheimer's disease and the 80 other kinds of conditions that cause dementia.
Mm. As I was reading your book, well, I'm always learning new vocabulary because English is my first language. But one word that I learned is, or phrase is, immigrant homesickness. And, you know, I am an immigrant. I love my country, my new country,
Of
Canada.
course.
But I have a sense of loss of my family, my language, my culture. I see it. I can almost I go to my country once a year to spend some time with my family, but I have this sense of loss. They are there and I'm here and we're not sharing the same life. And I couldn't even go back or think about going back because now I am a citizen of this country, yet the sense of loss of my culture and my language still there. I go back home and my vocabulary fails me, you know, like I don't speak English that well and I'm losing my Spanish vocabulary and I speak mediocre French right here in the province of Quebec.
Oh, you had to learn French too. Oh my goodness. Well, let me tell you that I heard my father was always welcoming young Swiss immigrants to our house and speaking to them. And he said something that made me learn about ambiguous loss in my home. He said, don't stay in the United States longer than 3 months or you'll never again know where home is. I hear you saying that about Canada too, that you have your foot in 2 different countries. And that's how it probably will be. That is, you have a higher tolerance for ambiguity because you're able to do that. In other words, the people who cannot do that and do it well need to have the certainty of being in one place or another. They don't like change. You're in the midst of change. All immigrants are. But mostly when I speak around the world about ambiguous loss, immigrants can relate to the concept because they are experiencing it. They love their home language, they love their home country, and they also are doing well in their new place and learn to like it. My grandmother, who came from Switzerland, would not learn English. She said, I lost the mountains, I lost the wonderful cool air of Switzerland. I will not also lose my language. And I see women, older women today who say the same thing, and I have very great empathy for them. Language is something very precious to us. I really empathize with what you were saying.
Another thing that we have suffered lately is this, we experienced or we witnessed the assassination of George Floyd, and there were huge demonstrations around the world. And I learned a word in your book called CrossGenerational Trauma. And this is the trauma of these people who have been living discrimination and even before that slavery for hundreds of years. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about cross-generational trauma.
Well, there are many experts on trauma who also write about this, but I wrote about it also to say that it can involve some of the trauma we're seeing in Black families, especially what happened here. I live just a few blocks from where George Floyd was killed, and I could see the demonstrations that took place. My heart was with them. It was a terrible thing. It was a murder. And what's happened is that I think when the families who were enslaved hundreds of years ago were separated and beaten and treated very badly, and in the first place, kidnapped from their home country, that ambiguous loss was so traumatic back there and never ever dealt with. and then passed on down across generations. And we can argue about whether it's genetics or whether it's role modeling sociologically. And I think the answer will turn out to be, when all the research is in, both. It's both social learning and it's both genetic transmission, not in the genes, but on what turns on the genes, the stress management, the resilience, the panic, and so on, is passed on down through the generations. So the rest of us have got to become more educated. That is, we have to educate ourselves about what this means for our brothers and sisters who are of color in this, in our community primarily, but in our country and when we vote as well, because things have got to be better. I thought they were better, and I realized then during the pandemic they aren't better, and the disparities between people regarding healthcare and income and living paycheck to paycheck and childcare, we have a lot of work to do yet.
Okay, so being that these laws can be no resolved, ambiguity laws, what are some tips that you could give us in order to build some resilience, in order to accept these changes, accept these losses that we have in our life, and move on?
Well, I recommend what's called both and thinking. You know, I lost a lot during the pandemic. I'll say it again. I both lost a lot during the pandemic, and I learned a lot, and am pleased to see that I'm more resilient than I used to be. So you balance what you're saying in the times of ambiguity, because there is no definitive statement, true or false. So you say, let's say you have a grandparent with Alzheimer's disease. He is both here and gone. And let's say your loved one is a soldier fighting somewhere else. I am both hoping he will come back to me and proud of what he is doing. Somehow you have to have a both and regarding what's going on, because you can't say, I know precisely what's happening. Many times we don't. Many times we don't. And many relationship issues are unclear. My boyfriend just left me, and I hope we will be friends nevertheless. You could say that with divorce too. My husband and I just divorced, and we will be friends as we parent our children into the future. So it's embracing the ambiguity and not looking for an absolute. Well, he's now dead to me. He's out of my life. Well, most people we ever had a relationship with are never out of our life, even if we dislike them. They're still with us in some way. We might be more reactionary to what they taught us then, but they still have affected who we are. We're the accumulation of relationships we've had.
I have a friend. I have a friend who, when she was a child, she was sexually abused by a family member. And now this person has to see her uncle, let's say, and he's there, but the trust and the family ties are no longer there. There is a sense of loss, even though the uncle is still there. I wonder how to deal with that, with the pain and sorrow and sense of betrayal, while that person is still giving her Christmas present, let's say.
Oh, that's very difficult. You're saying the uncle was the perpetrator.
Yes.
Yeah. I think sometimes it depends on her, because I think she needs to take her power back. I would assume she would keep relationships with her mother and father, even let me talk more hypothetically. Even if you don't like your parents or your siblings, I think you should keep a relationship with them. But I always say, unless there was incest or some kind of abuse, if there is abuse in the family, if you were the victim of abuse, I think you can create another way of staying with the family members you want to stay with, that is visiting them, maybe not staying at the house, maybe staying at a hotel instead, maybe staying less long than you used to stay. And in this case, if it's not a sibling, it's not a parent, it's an uncle, I think you have the right to say you don't want to see him anymore, if that's how you feel. I think the person who was abused has a right to set the boundaries.
Well, we have so much to deal with. I wonder if there's any question that I neglected to ask you that you would like to go deeper into.
Well, I think ambiguous loss, we talked about it. Did I answer all your questions about that?
Yes. So, okay. To close it up, can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners find out more about the work that you're doing?
Okay. I could also read a little bit from the book if you'd like me to.
Oh, that would be lovely. Yes.
Okay. And what was the first thing you asked me to do?
After you finish reading about a little bit of the book, to tell us one last time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you're doing?
Okay, that would be the website. Okay, I'm just, okay. I wonder in conclusion if I could read a little bit from the book that might give you a taste of the book.
Please do.
I was writing about loss and change, the myth of closure, ambiguous loss in a time of pandemic and change. And since so much is about ambiguity, I wasn't quite sure how to end the book. So here's how I did it. In the end, your main benefit in any time of adversity is that you can discover your resiliency, that you are stronger than you think you are, and that you can withstand long-term hardship and unprecedented loss, even if sometimes you feel despair or anger. Take a break, talk with somebody, and when you're ready, carry on again. With remarkable resilience, we find a way to cope with loss, sometimes with grit or with humor, other times with a mixture of sadness or anger and resentment. You may have had some strange responses to your losses lately, but likely they were normal for abnormal times that we have. And now, how do I end a book about ambiguity and no closure? My grandson said, end it in mid-sentence. True, there's no final conclusion to what I've written. Make your own sense of it. Along the way, try to find some meaning and new hope in your life. Let your tolerance for ambiguity grow, for therein lies the resilience to help us live with loss, past, present, and future. Few losses are entirely clear, and none need closure. I leave it at that.
Wow. The way I deal with loss is by searching social interactions. Either it doesn't matter whether I have anything to contribute to a conversation or not, just by being among other people and listening and sharing that physical space, it just helps me get over my pain or sorrow, whatever I'm going through. And this is one of the things that makes this COVID so difficult, that we were prevented from having those social interactions. So that was so difficult, but I mean, that's in my opinion, that's the best, that's the how I cope with pain and suffering and sorrow and loneliness, just by being in the space of some other people.
But I think your podcast may, by the way, that means you're a very resilient person. It's a wonderful, social interaction is a wonderful way to cope with loss. And your podcast, I must say, is helping so many people. And I hope it's helping you too, to be connected to people in this very weird time we're in. And I find talking with you is joyful for me too. It helps me cope with my losses too.
Thank you, Pauline. And can you tell us your website, please?
Yes, you can find all the books and articles I've written and other things on the website, which is www.ambiguousloss.com. And the new book should be available at any bookstore or online or in person in your community.
And all the links will be in my website. Pauline, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. This was just joyful. Thank you so much.